All right, let's do this. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. This time, we're heading to Baltimore.
Oh, interesting. What part?
Well, specifically, we're going to zero in on one block, the 900 block of North Bradford Street.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's so special about this particular block?
It's a story about demolition, at least on the surface. But the article we're looking at from the Washington Post, it goes so much deeper.
Deeper how?
Like, they didn't just report on the buildings coming down. It's like they kind of, I don't know, use that demolition as a way to uncover all these lives, all this history that was tangled up with those houses.
Wow, so it's more about the people than the bricks and mortar.
Exactly. It makes you think about what happens to a neighborhood's soul when the buildings disappear, you know?
Yeah, I get you. It's like those memories, those stories, are they just gone?
Right. And this article, it tries to capture those before they're lost forever.
So where do we start with this story? Back in the beginning, I assume.
Yeah, let's rewind the clock back to about 1905. Imagine Bradford Street in its prime.
Okay, paint me a picture. What am I seeing?
It's bustling, full of life. Tons of immigrant families, Czechs, Germans, Poles, they're all making their way in this new world.
A real melting pot, huh? That's classic early 20th century America.
Totally. And they're all striving for that American dream, right? Building a life for themselves and their kids.
You could almost hear the echoes of their voices in the article's descriptions, right?
Oh, absolutely. And get this. There was this one builder, Frank Novak, who was nicknamed the Two-Story King. He was putting up houses left and right.
The Two-Story Kings. That's a cool nickname. Why'd they call him that?
Because he was known for these practical, affordable two-story homes, maybe like the starter homes of the era.
Makes sense. Affordable housing for a growing community.
And speaking of families, there's this one, the article really focuses on the Mifkovit family. Lived at 930 North Bradford, 6 kids.
6 kids. Wow, that's a full house.
I know, right? Can you imagine their dinner table, all those different cultures and languages swirling together?
It's such a perfect snapshot of that close-knit, diverse community that thrived on Bradford Street back then. More than just houses, you know?
Right. It's like the article is saying, don't just look at the buildings, look at the lives lived within those walls.
That's a great way to put it.
But like most American cities, post-war suburbanization hits Bradford Street hard.
Yeah, that was a huge shift for so many urban areas. What happened?
People started moving out, seeking that, grass and trees lifestyle. And then the factories started moving too. Jobs dried up.
So it's that classic ripple effect, right? One thing leads to another, and suddenly the whole landscape of the city changes.
Yeah, and the people who stayed behind, they were often the ones who couldn't afford to leave or didn't want to abandon their roots.
I see. They were stuck dealing with the consequences of those larger forces at play.
There's this crazy map in the article showing Baltimore's housing clusters. It really highlights that uneven impact.
Oh, interesting. What does it show?
Some areas booming, thriving, while others, like Bradford Street, were struggling just to stay afloat.
Yeah, that visual really drives home the point, doesn't it? That some neighborhoods were left behind. And that leads to the whole issue of blight, right?
Right. And the article makes it clear blight, it isn't just about a place looking rundown. It's a whole web of problems. Safety concerns, property values plummeting.
And those things can lead to increased crime, too. The downward spiral.
So the argument for demolition is usually focused on removing those hazards, trying to boost the value of whatever's left.
Right, but that's a tricky issue. Does demolition actually revitalize a neighborhood? Or does it just displace people and wipe away history?
That's the debate, isn't it? Is it just a Band-Aid on a bigger problem? Think about it. 17,000 vacant homes in Baltimore alone. And we're talking millions spent nationwide on demolition.
Makes you wonder if there are better ways to use those resources. Maybe investing in revitalization that doesn't involve displacement.
Right. Could we find ways to honor the history of these neighborhoods while still breathing new life into them? It's tough, for sure.
No easy answers.
The article introduces us to a couple of guys, David Bell and Alvin Gentry, both Black residents, longtime ties to Bradford Street.
What are their stories like?
They remember a time when things were more, integrated, more neighborly.
That's really interesting. It hints at those demographic shifts that happen in so many cities mid-century.
Right. As white residents moved to the suburbs, Black families often moved into those neighborhoods they hadn't been able to live in before.
I see. And it sounds like Bell and Gentry witnessed those changes firsthand.
There's this one line from Bell that really stuck with me. He says, "When I came out of prison, all the white folks were gone."
Wow. Simple statement, but so powerful.
Right. You can almost feel the weight of all those changes in that one sentence, like a whole chapter of history summed up.
And it makes you think about all those individual lives caught up in those larger forces, doesn't it? It's like a story within a story.
Totally. And then there's Mabel Olds.
Who's Mabel?
She was the last resident of 936 North Bradford.
Oh, wow. So she represents that human cost of demolition, right? The people whose lives are disrupted, whose homes are lost.
Exactly. Mabel, she'd built her whole life on that block, raised her family there.
Can't imagine how hard it must have been to leave.
I know, right? She even says in the article, I just don't know about tearing down good houses.
She's got a point.
And her son chimes in with, people need houses, not dog parks, which, really hits home.
Yeah, it makes you think about whose needs are being prioritized, doesn't it?
And then there's the whole Johns Hopkins connection, which complicates things even further.
Johns Hopkins, the hospital. What's their role in all this?
The Olds family, they believe the demolitions were basically serving Hopkins' interests, like clearing the way for expansion or something.
So it raises that issue of power dynamics. Is this
Yeah.
about genuine community needs or about the expansion of a big institution?
Exactly. Who gets to decide the fate of these neighborhoods? Whose vision of progress wins out? It's complicated.
For sure. And it makes me wonder, yeah, it's a classic story, isn't it? Like progress for some, but displacement for others.
And it's not just losing your house, right? It's like losing a whole network, a community.
Exactly. It disrupts those social connections, those memories tied to a place. You're uprooted from everything you know.
It's like, who gets a say in how a neighborhood changes? Whose voices are being heard,
It makes you think about who benefits from these so-called improvements and who gets left behind.
But hold on, because amidst all this demolition, there's this glimmer of hope, the article points out. It's this nonprofit, Details.
Details. What do they do?
Instead of just leveling those houses, they carefully take them apart, piece by piece. Salvage the materials.
Oh, that's interesting. Like deconstruction instead of demolition. What happens to the materials?
They use them for other projects, plus it creates jobs, often for folks who have a hard time finding work.
So it's sustainable and socially responsible.
Two birds, one stone. And there's this great anecdote about one of their workers, Bernadette Buxton. She's a recovering addict, and while she's working on a house, she finds $200 stashed in the ceiling.
Wow, what a sign. It's like those houses are full of little secrets, these hidden pieces of the past.
I know, right? Like a little time capsule. Speaking of the past, there are these two discoveries during the demolition that really hit home for me.
What kind of discoveries?
The first one is about a guy named Jonathan Todd. He's a descendant of the Mifkovich family we talked about.
A family with 6 kids.
Right, yeah. So Jonathan, he actually visits 930 North Bradford just before it's torn down, gets to connect with his family's past, stand in the same spot where his grandparents live.
I can only imagine how powerful that must have been, like touching history.
And then there's the Croissant family. They're descended from the very first owner of 936 North Bradford.
Oh, wow. So they go way back.
Way back. And get this, they end up meeting Mabel Olds, the last resident of that house. Two families, generations apart, linked by this one place.
That's incredible. A real testament to the power of place, bridging those historical and, I'm guessing, racial divides.
It's a pretty amazing story.
It really is.
So we've got family history tied up in these houses, and then the article takes us to the demolition itself. We meet Reds Banks, the guy operating the excavator. It's a pretty powerful image watching him reduce those homes to rubble.
It's like watching history literally crumble before your eyes. What are we choosing to remember? And what are we letting go of,
And in the middle of all this, we hear from Big Mike Saunders, a guy who's lived in the neighborhood his whole life. He's watching this demolition, and he's not buying it.
What do you mean?
He's cynical, thinks it's all for Johns Hopkins' benefit, not the community's.
I can understand that, that distrust between institutions and communities, especially when there's a history of broken promises.
Right. And then, to complicate things even more, the article brings up the story of Henrietta Lacks.
Wait, Henrietta Lacks, the woman whose cells were used for all that medical research.
The one and only. And the connection here is that Johns Hopkins took her cells without her consent, which obviously raises a lot of ethical questions.
Right, it brings in issues of medical ethics, racial injustice.
It adds another layer to the demolition of Bradford Street. Like, what is the hospital's legacy in this community?
It's not just about bricks and mortar. It's about the history of these institutions and how they impact people's lives.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that progress, it's not always a straight line. And sometimes it can come at a cost.
Yeah, definitely. It makes you think about those ethical lines, like when you've got these powerful institutions interacting with communities that don't always have the same resources.
It's complicated, but I think that's what this whole deep dive is about, right? It's not just about one block in Baltimore. It's about all these forces at play in so many cities across America:
Mhm.
decline, renewal, gentrification.
Exactly. And how do we balance that need for progress with preserving history, you know?
Yeah. It's a tough one. And I guess it all comes back to, like, what does progress even mean? Who benefits from these big renewal projects?
Right. And how do we make sure that the people who've called a neighborhood home for years, for generations even, aren't pushed out in the process?
It's all about perspective, right? What looks like a positive change to some can feel like losing something precious to others.
Hmm.
And that's why those stories, like Mabel Olds or Big Mike Saunders, they really hit home.
Absolutely. They remind us that we're talking about real people's lives here,
Mm.
not just abstract ideas.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Bradford Street, I'm left wondering about our own cities. What do they choose to preserve? What stories are getting lost in the name of progress?
It's a question we should all be asking. What histories are hidden right under our noses? And even more importantly, who gets to decide what's worth saving and what gets torn down?
That's a great question, and I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the heart of Baltimore. It's been a journey, and I hope it's got you thinking about your own community and the stories it holds. Until next time, keep exploring.